All right, welcome everybody. I'm Ruben Jeffrey, and we're privileged to have with us, really honored to have with us this morning, Natalie Jaresko, Ukraine's finance minister. By way of introduction, I think you all have her biography, but I think it's fair to note one of the startling things on the page is that her progression from the suburbs of Chicago to the finance ministry of Ukraine is not the usual path for most finance ministers of various countries around the world. I thought I might start, Minister Jaresko, with a little question. Can you comment a little bit on your personal journey?
It has been a remarkable journey, and certainly one that's unpredictable. I grew up in Chicago, a Ukrainian American. My family emigrated from Ukraine shortly after World War II. I grew up frankly speaking, very patriotic American, very patriotic Ukrainian simultaneously. And I can imagine that's hard for people to understand being united, but Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union as I was growing up, and no one ever could have imagined that it would be a free country someday. And then it became a free country. I took from the United States and took from what the United States gave my family in terms of a life, freedom, a place to raise their children, to get a good job, to become literally solid middle class, which my parents were able to do here, thanks to the US system. And I took those values and I translated them in my own way, as any child would, into a certain love for public policy. I went to the Kennedy School of Government, where Richard Haass was my professor. And I'm really sorry Richard couldn't be here today, because Richard introduced me to the State Department and to the Office of Soviet Union Economic Affairs. So I have perhaps to thank Richard for being in this position today, or blame him. One of the two. At the end of the day, we'll see. I went then to the State Department to serve as first a presidential management intern, then later, when Ukraine became free, Bob Zoellick was the Undersecretary of Economic Affairs, said, you should go out to the US Embassy in Kiev. You're an economist, you speak Ukrainian. I was not a foreign service officer, I was a civil servant. When I got to Ukraine, I had not been there before. And it was remarkable because, as many of you have heard, you're just overwhelmed with the potential and the opportunity of a 45 million populated state in the middle of Europe, extraordinarily wealth in all kinds of resources, agricultural, mineral, human resources. And yet it has been so misguided. 70 years of communism, more recently 23 years of incomplete reforms, corruption, the last regime, the Yanukovych regime, taking advantage at a very high level of styles of corruption, put an additional $40 billion of hard currency debt on the shoulders of the Ukrainian people. And yet I found myself consistently wanting to help Ukraine realize that potential. And when a few months ago, right around Thanksgiving, the President and the Prime Minister turned to me and said, we'd like you to help us, there was no way to say no. Every day you were seeing people volunteer to go to the front to protect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in a war against a very difficult aggressor. And I would be of no use at the front. That was not a value add that I could bring to this equation. So this was what I thought I could do to help the country. And I believe that today, every person, and I ask all of you, to do what you can for Ukraine, because I mentioned this at the breakfast table. I feel this is an absolutely critical time in world history. And Ukraine is on the forefront of the values and the principles that we all hold so dear. We're living it.
Madam Minister, thank you for that. It's really a breathtaking progression. You step into this job, it's not as if Ukraine, the economy, was without its challenges from 2008, actually before, to the present. Then Russia invades, or excuse me, there's a spontaneous eruption of civil unrest with outside support of little green men. Can you comment today on the effect of this conflict on the Ukrainian people and the economy?
It's more than I think anyone can imagine. First and foremost, it's a humanitarian crisis of proportions not seen since World War II. We have over 5,000 dead civilians and military, over 15,000 wounded, 1.1 million internally displaced people in our country. over 1 million people who have no home, no job, nothing left, who've been we have to find them a new place to live. Their entire lives have been disrupted. UNICEF says that 1 million children have been affected in our country from the illegal annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine. The cost to the economy is tremendous. It's some 20% of our economy, and it's an important industrial production center for the economy. Last year, overall industrial production dropped some 11%, but in Donbass and Donetsk and Lugansk regions, which are where the Russian-sponsored terrorists are, it's some 20 and 30%. This affects the exports, which then affects the amount of hard currency in my country. The currency then affects, as you can imagine, confidence, the banking system, the exchange rate, depreciation, and you have a vicious cycle, an unfortunate vicious cycle, which is very hard to put a stop in when you can't stop the war.
A major component of that to kind of stabilize things relates to the overall external debt situation of the economy. And from reading the newspapers, it looks like you've had a pretty busy week in Washington and elsewhere around the United States, working with the IMF, other creditor organizations and sovereigns on the Ukrainian debt situation to sort of give you some breathing room. How are those discussions going and progressing, and where do you want to take them?
I don't know that any sovereign debt restructuring is easy, and I don't think that any country, likes to be in the position that we're in. The one thing I can say is that this situation is created primarily by not a country's willingness to pay or a country's financial situation, but by a very, very unexpected and very difficult war on top of the complications of the economy. You probably know that the IMF chief, Madame Lagarde, announced a $40 billion package for Ukraine. That $40 billion is 3 pieces. It's $17.5 billion over 4 years from the IMF, of which we've received the first $5 billion tranche after meeting prior actions, the conditionality and the agreement for the first tranche. That $5 billion, just to give you a sense, doubled our reserves at the central bank. That's how low a level of central bank reserves we had prior to the agreement. The second part of this is $8 billion of bilateral, multilateral support from the United States, from the EU, from Canada, from Poland, Germany. Sweden has now come to the table with bilateral support. Also multilateral, so the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the World Bank. That money is more 1-year, 18-month money commitments. And then the final piece is the debt restructuring, which is $15 billion, $15.3 billion in what we are supposed to achieve in savings over the period of the program, or over 4 years. And given the amount of public sector sovereign debt that we have, quasi-sovereign and state guaranteed, this means that this restructuring is going to be complicated. It's going to require some combination, a combination of both maturity extensions, coupon reductions, and principal reductions. And it's something that's going to have to give us not just balance of payments support, but we're going to have to try and kind of build our medium-term debt sustainability back over time to become a healthy economy and restore growth. Creditors are naturally acting surprised. But if you look at the markets, the pricing in the markets of our sovereign debt, I think there's an acknowledgement of our situation. I think the IMF agreement lays it out very clearly, in a very black and white sense, what the boxes we need to fit into. Now we're in a collaborative process with our creditors. I came to meet with creditors on the West Coast, East Coast, and then I'll be in London next week to talk to them, to our largest creditors, because we want to do this in a collaborative way. We want to do this in a way where we can try and build a vision as to how Ukraine moves forward together. And I think so far we've gotten a reasonably good sense that everyone is supportive and understanding. I think the hard thing for everyone is to understand what kinds of shocks remain in the system. So you can take the IMF program and you have a baseline forecast for what it looks like, but you can imagine how hard it is to predict how close we'll be to that baseline forecast if there are external shocks, if the very fragile ceasefire doesn't hold, if there are exchange rate shocks, if there's a banking crisis, if. So I think there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle that are just not predictable, and that's the hard part, because everyone wants to look forward to peace, growth, but how we get there and when we get there is more complicated.
I'll resist the temptation to drill down on the elements of the the debt restructuring. I expect other members might have comments on that. But alongside your immediate efforts related to the debt, you, President Poroshenko, and the other ministers have a broad-based reform agenda for the economy and really society as a whole. Do you want to give us some sense as to the key elements of that?
There are three. First, it's to stabilize the banking and finance system. There is no real economy, there's no businessman who can plan his budget when you have volatility in currency between 20 to 1 and 40 to 1 at any given time. So we need to eliminate the volatility. We need to stabilize the economy, reduce the inflation pressure so that the real bank lending rates become possible. Today, the discount rate at our central bank is 32%, which means lending is at 35 or more. You know, there are a few businesses in the world that can afford 35, 37% interest rates. So stabilizing the banking and financial system is absolutely critical, number one. Second is restoring growth. Restoring growth by creating a better business environment. So that's everything from deregulation to broadening the tax base, reducing the burden of taxes on those who are paying by instead bringing in those who are not. We have a large shadow economy. We need to bring those folks back into the formal economy. They need to do their part. We've increased taxes on the wealthy. Again, compared to US tax rates or European, it's still nothing. It's a 20% marginal tax rate, 15% being the basic personal tax rate. But all the passive income is now at 20% as well. So we've cut out the ability to pick and choose for those wealthy people who try to optimize their taxes. We've then, the third part of broadening the tax base is cutting out the big business loopholes. We have many industries, many tycoons who've benefited, not unlike, I suppose, in other countries, but maybe to a larger extent on loopholes. And bringing them back in to the fold, having them pay their fair share. We've adopted transfer pricing that doesn't allow them to, for example, shift their profits abroad anymore. So that broadening of the tax base, we're in the midst of a large tax administration reform, making it more service-oriented. Reforming our state-owned enterprises. We still have some 3,000 state-owned enterprises, which we need to start by figuring out what's left, what hasn't been stolen or what's disappeared. So auditing them, establishing a fair, transparent way to picking the CEOs of these companies, and then moving them as quickly as possible to privatization. And the third big element is anti-corruption. The country has been held back to a great extent by corruption over the 23, I would even say last 100 years, because the Soviet tradition had no less corruption, it was just different. The anti-corruption efforts are broad-based. They're everything from enforcement, meaning a new anti-corruption bureau, which has very, very great deal of authority and funding to actually enforce anti-corruption, to policy-based changes which change the nature of how business is done and how government works. Perfect example, for 23 years, we've had middlemen in our trade, in our import of gas to the country. We had middlemen who were siphoning off hundreds of millions of dollars somehow, somewhere. We no longer have any intermediaries in our trade, neither from what we continue to buy in terms of imported gas from Russia, which now is only 30% of our purchases, and 70% we now purchase from Europe, reverse gas. Again, in neither case, in neither direction are there intermediaries. We've just eliminated that. Other kinds of policy-based elimination of corruption have to do with e-procurement, cleaning up the state purchasing. There's a lot of corruption in the state purchasing, state purchase element, and we're moving that out into the open, into a transparent online type of e-procurement. I think that at the average citizen's level, we need to show them that affects their lives, because whether or not there's an intermediary in gas, that's a good thing for me from a budget standpoint. It's a good thing for the people as a whole, but they don't feel it. So at the average citizen's level, we've started a reform of our police, because that's where they see it. They see these militia stopping them and asking them for bribes day after day, morning after morning. We've introduced a new police system in Kiev. It's being rolled out right now. I just saw yesterday on Facebook the new police cars. We've hired all new policemen. We've changed it, the training, the financial transparency of the police. This is something that the average citizen will feel, that he's no longer have somebody with his hand out every morning when he drives to work. And that'll roll out across the country. We've brought in experts. Our Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs who's doing this is from Georgia. She did it in Georgia, ECA, and she did it successfully there. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel, we're just trying to accelerate these changes. So those three things, within each of them there's energy sector, we can talk about other sectoral changes, but I would say financial stabilization, creating the path, the underpinning for real economic growth, and then anti-corruption.
Maybe for those of us who are less knowledgeable about the Ukraine economy on a real-time basis, and from my perspective, and maybe for some of the members here of a certain age, I can remember learning, you memorize countries in high school and stuff. And Soviet Union, Ukraine, breadbasket of Soviet Union. So agriculture is kind of part of the economy. You've got issues with energy, you've got trade, you've got tourism. Obviously there's an industrious population. What are kind of the key engines of economic growth as you make this transition?
Clearly agriculture is number one. Last year, if it weren't for agriculture, the economy would probably have had an even much more difficult time. Agriculture grew last year despite what was going on, and agriculture is not being hampered by the war. I have to make very clear, as horrendous and horrible as the war is, and as much as I want you to take to heart that the Ukrainian people are fighting for the values and principles that the free world holds dearly, I want to make also clear at the same time that that's 7% of the territory of the country. 93% of the territory of the country is open and doing business. 93% of the territory is going to work, receiving their pension, sending their children to school, and ready for and welcoming of investment. Agriculture being number one, Ukraine is the largest sunflower oil exporter in the world. It's the number 4 grain exporter in the world. And that's all in still a relatively inefficient sector. So the potential of agriculture is even that much greater, and food processing. Second, in energy, we're an electricity exporter traditionally. We've had some problems, unfortunately, with our coal supplies because of the occupied East. But in general, Ukraine's energy sector is very interesting. And one of the things we've done now in breaking up our state oil and gas company, Naftogaz, into 2 pieces, transportation and storage under the EU Third Energy Charter, gives us an opportunity to attract U.S. investment into energy. That's important for multiple reasons. One, technology, nobody better than the United States to help us in that area. Number 2, corporate governance. Number 3, ensuring that this sector never returns to that endemic corporate corruption. So I think U.S. investment in energy and energy efficiency is very critical. Third, I would say that infrastructure. We have a great deal of value added in transit, north, south, east, west. But our roads, our bridges, our airports, our ports, and that relates directly back to agriculture, frankly, and the ports. All of that requires a great deal of new investment. Tourism, I was speaking to several people. It is a beautiful country. It is a European country, and it has quite a bit of European history, whether you're of Polish heritage, German heritage, Lithuanian heritage. Everyone can find something, Jewish heritage. Everyone can find something in Ukraine. Ukraine is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, and very tolerant state. And so everyone has a little bit of history to find if they're interested. I think the last thing I'd say is that as a manufacturing platform, Ukraine offers an incredible opportunity today. For any American, for Europeans, for Russian investors, it doesn't matter. But given our cost competitiveness, especially after the unfortunate depreciation of the currency that has its negatives with this population, but it's a positive for exporters, our deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union gives us access to the European Union markets unfettered in a way that, frankly speaking, no one else has. So if you take the resource base, natural resources, agricultural resources, the human resource base, the IT sector, for example, in value-added IT sector, if you take that resource base and that access to market and that proximity to the European market, it's an incredible platform for the future.
Great, thank you. Just, can we come back to energy? I think many of us can recall over the past, really the better part of the past decade, it's like sort of a right of winter. Russians cut off gas to Ukraine. And then there's a big negotiation, and NAFGAS gets in the middle, and it all gets sorted out somehow. And then spring comes, and we don't hear about it for another 9 months. You've kind of, if I understand correctly, you've really transformed that equation in some very significant ways. Can you maybe elaborate?
So first of all, you didn't hear that this winter, so you know it's different. And I will also add we had a relatively warm winter, which means God is on our side. You got to look for everything you can get in this situation. So first and foremost, we've started to diversify where we import gas from. And that's very important from an energy dependency perspective. It's not that there's any problem with importing Russian gas, but having a sole exporter of gas to Russia, from Russia to Ukraine is obviously has its consequences. We've now moved from what was 100% import from Russia to, in the beginning of this year, we're at 30% import from Russia, 70% re-imported from the EU. It's not only an independence issue, it actually is a pricing issue and a fiscal issue. So as a finance minister, it's about $50 per 1,000 cubic meters cheaper when we import it from the European Union. The second part of this is that we're reforming how we use gas, and I think that's critical because Ukraine has also been known not only to have corruption in this sector, but to be one of the most inefficient energy users in Europe, if not in the world. And we've already reduced our consumption by some 20%, which helps both financially, but it also helps from the energy independence standpoint, less to import. I think on energy efficiency, one of the important things for us is to stop subsidizing the state-owned enterprise of Naftogaz and instead provide subsidies as needed to the vulnerable parts of the population. So we are on a track. We've agreed with the IMF, and we did one large increase in pricing last year for the households, and we've announced another for April 1st of this year, which should take us to 50% cost recovery. Next year, 75%, and then within 2 years, 100% cost recovery. What does that mean? It means that we will have to provide subsidies to the vulnerable part of our population. A large and growing part of the population will not be able to afford these prices. So a means-tested social subsidy has to be in place. And today we have a social subsidy in place. It's not means-tested yet, but we'll get there. Right now, it's something that we've tried to make easier for people, less tiresome and less irksome for people to go get the subsidy. Now they just mail a form in and it's automatic. They don't have to stand in line. They don't have to deal with bureaucrats. And by doing that, they understand the price of gas, and so they use less. It's natural. So we eliminate, again, every one of these reforms has multiple angles. We eliminate corruption because we're not putting money into the state-owned enterprise. We're putting it into the hands of the users. We're reducing overall consumption, which helps us on independence. It helps us fiscally. Last year, the government financed the Naftogaz, the state oil and gas monopoly, deficit of 110 billion hryvnia, which is the equivalent of about $10 billion. It was more than our state budget deficit. This year, we've budgeted for a deficit of 30 billion approximately hryvnia, or about $1.5 billion. 10 billion last year, 1.5 billion this year. That's a huge change. So taken together, I think that the energy sector reform is really something that showcases all the different sides of what we're trying to do and do quickly.
Great, that's pretty impressive turnaround. I see a lot of questions coming from the tables, but let me ask one final one from my seat, and that is maybe to widen the aperture a little bit, Madam Minister, how do you see the implications of what's going on in the Ukraine for the broader political and security situation in the former Soviet states and Western Europe as a whole?
I think that's the most important question, and I guess part of what I tried to do in Washington and when I speak here is to make sure that everyone understands this is not a war for territory. Russia's a very large country. It doesn't need Ukraine's territory. This is not a war about language because, frankly speaking, I'm a Ukrainian speaker, and I have more problems in Ukraine than any Russian speaker will ever have. There are more people who don't understand Ukrainian than will not understand Russian. It's a multilingual state, always has been, and will continue to be. This is a war of principles. This is a war based on the fact that the Ukrainian people sacrificed their lives to choose a European future, not European Union membership. They died for European values: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. We recently had our March for Dignity in Kiev, and the front line were 3 different Orthodox churches, a Greek Catholic church, a Roman Catholic representative, the imam of the Muslim mosque, the rabbi from the Jewish synagogue, multiple Baptist, Pentecostal, all linked arm in arm, walking forward through the streets of Kiev. And that's normal in Ukraine. We have the largest Mormon tabernacle east of Dusseldorf. Mormons are illegal in the country neighboring us. It is an issue of values and principles. We have a very vibrant, albeit fragmented, vibrant civil society that demonstrates, has revolutions. It holds everyone to the fire right now in terms of reform and is a very, very important part of this process. That's not possible in the neighboring country next door. And so this war is about the principles And it's about, I believe, not allowing our country to maintain its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and to live by those principles. And I think it's not even just an issue for Europe. I think it's an issue for the world, for the free world. I think it's an issue for the free world to think, what did it mean after World War II when we established the institutions of the United Nations, the Helsinki Principles, the OSCE, the Budapest Memorandum? What did it mean when we made promises for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons and in return for guarantees of security? All of these institutions and principles are being trampled upon today. And I think that has an effect not just in Ukraine, not just in the former Soviet Union, not just in Europe. It has a global effect. While the United States today tries to negotiate with Iran, they have to have in the background, what did the Budapest Memorandum mean, and how will that figure into the Iranians' minds when they try and negotiate nuclear nonproliferation going forward? What will the Baltics believe about NATO and Article 5 in terms of security if Russia, if the Kremlin is continually poking at them by doing flyovers over NATO airspace, cyber attacks? Does Article 5 protect you from a cyber attack? Does Article 5 protect you when in Estonia you come across the border, you pick up one of their officials and you kidnap him to the other side? There's a constant testing of the institutions that we all believe kept us from any possible World War III. And I think the maintenance of the institutions, the principles, the values, and Ukraine in this war is absolutely the testing point of them, is critical to avoiding anything like that ever happens in the world again. So I think this is probably the most important thing that we could focus on in terms of the 21st century.
Wow. Okay, why don't I turn it over to those of you here, no doubt have a lot of questions. I think the protocol here is state your name and affiliation, no multi-part questions, please. You can try, but she'll only answer one of them. And kind of keep them short and to the point, because there are a lot of them. Please.
Hi, Jay Coe from Singular Gov. You're well familiar with the enterprise funds that were set up at the transition point in the 90s. What support should the United States and the West have for private investment into Ukraine in supporting the Ukrainian economy going forward?
Yes, I was honored and privileged to be the first country director at the Enterprise Fund in Kiev. The concept, I think, is fabulous, and I think there should be more done exactly in that area. It's going to be a difficult year or two. It'll be a difficult period of time to attract major foreign investment while there's a war ongoing. I will continue to try. And we have select cases where even now, we did a 3G license competition. We had 3 new investors in our 3G just last month. So it's not that we won't receive any foreign investment, but it's going to be a battle. So I think anything like an enterprise fund, which can spur and accelerate investment into small and medium-sized business, create jobs, show that growth is possible. I think OPIC being active in Ukraine is important. I think reopening Export-Import Bank and enabling U.S. exports, in particular in the agriculture sector, but elsewhere as well, is critical. I think overall greater and deeper U.S. financial support for Ukraine, because I go back, it all starts with the stability of our banking system. Nobody can function with a banking system that's not strong, and we need to strengthen that banking system now. So I think that the United States has multiple tools. We're grateful for the things that we've received to date, but I think there's more that needs to be done on the real economy.
Great. Other questions?
Ann Marlowe from the Hudson Institute in Washington. Minister, could you speak about the economic impact of sanctions and where you'd like to see that go? Would you like to see more sanctions, fewer sanctions? How can that help?
I think first and foremost, we'd like to see the sanctions that are in place be maintained and that there be no division in the transatlantic partnership with regard to the sanctions that are currently in place. As long as the Minsk Agreement, Minsk I, Minsk II are not being fulfilled in full, those sanctions need to remain in place. And on the second part, I believe, and my president, our government believes, that any increase in violence, any further disruption to the ceasefire ought to be married with increased sanctions. I think the sanctions have had they have a critical role in trying to change the psychology of the aggressor. clearly energy prices have helped, and it's hard for anyone to say how much of what's happened is a result of $50 a barrel oil and how much is a result of sanctions. But I think taken together, I think it is starting to change, and I believe that sanctions are an important part of the psychology of the aggressor, making choices. He has to make choices with regard to what it's worth and what the next potential set of sanctions might mean. I think that right now it's critical for the European Union to renew. I believe they've made a decision to put off the decision until May. But I believe that maintaining them, being united in them, and accelerating them if there's an acceleration in violence is critical.
Great.
First of all, I would just like to say that I have
Name
never
and
heard.
affiliation,
Oh,
sir. Excuse me.
Bruce Gelb, Council of American Ambassadors.
Thank you.
I've been coming to this wonderful room for a number of years. I've never heard a male or female do a more total job of analyzing a complicated situation the way you have.
Thank you.
I have a
Thank you.
I have a very old personal friendship with your country in 19, if you can believe anyone lived that long ago, in 1959, I walked along the banks of the Dnieper River in Kyiv with a group of young Ukrainians. What I learned was the depth of negative feelings verging on rage and frustration toward the Russians in Kyiv at that time. The article in the Foreign Affairs about this subject gave me insight that I did not fully grasp, and that is the Russians do not want anything close to friendship with the NATO part of the world next to them, and the little cartoon of NATO sticking its finger into the stomach of Russia with a man like Mr. Putin in there. All I can think of is all the things you want to do are things that are right, and I'm sorry for making this such a long statement, but my concern is that I don't want to see World War III start because of Ukraine. And what is it that is going to keep the Russians from going absolutely off the wall when you are successful in doing the financial things that you're talking about?
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to tackle that one.
I'm trying to think. First of all, Ukrainians are a very peaceful nation, and one of the reasons we found ourselves in this situation is because we had no border with Russia. We were brotherly nations, and we never had a defensive strategy because we could never have imagined that our brotherly nation would invade. I sat and watched the illegal annexation of Crimea, and I sat with my fellow Ukrainians, and we were just shocked as they just swept through and Ukrainians didn't even know. I mean, it was so unexpected. Today, after these events, Ukrainians have changed their vision of Russia, naturally. If you look at the pre- and post-war opinion polls on NATO, for example, Ukrainians were not particularly pro-NATO, never a majority of the people. Today, after the invasion of Crimea and the war in the East, a majority of Ukrainians are pro-NATO. If you look at the vision Ukrainians had being European, pro-EU, it was ranging between 30-40% before the war. It's now over 60%. If there's any positive that's come out of this, is that the Ukrainian people are more unified today than they've ever been before. They have a much clearer vision of the choices that they have, civilizational choices that they have, and they're much more dedicated to moving forward together. The president, prime minister, the parliament, everyone together, despite how hard it is. So that's the positive. You said something that I can't let go, which you said you don't want World War III to be caused by Ukraine. Ukraine is not the cause. If, God forbid, World War III occurs, it will not be because of Ukraine. Ukraine has done everything possible for peace. President Poroshenko, when elected in a free and fair democratic election in May of last year, called it a unilateral ceasefire immediately. It was broken. He's gone into ceasefire discussions twice, Minsk I, Minsk II. Today, Ukraine continues to remove its heavy artillery from the line of demarcation in accordance with the agreement. And last night, Grad's heavy artillery fired on our troops. Not only did they not remove them, they're using them today. Ukraine has allowed the OSCE in to look at and investigate, what is the proper, look at, check where we've put this heavy artillery, the security safety points. The Russian side, the terrorists, have not allowed them to get anywhere close. So Ukraine wants nothing more than peace. Everything we do is about trying to achieve peace. At the same time, you have to be amazed. I mean, this is a war that's been supported almost, half at least in the beginning, more maybe, by volunteers. I mentioned before that, how in my mind could I not take this job when men were volunteering for the front day after day, volunteering, not being conscripted, volunteering, hundreds and hundreds of men. We had a military that was completely, during the invasion of Crimea, it was clear, completely not ready, not financially, not from a command and control, not from supplies, certainly not from equipment. And yet we've held them. We have held them to this line, all by ourselves with the help of no one in the world. A poor country, a country in recession, a country with all kinds of problems, with two sets of elections, presidential and parliamentary. We have held a nuclear power, one of the largest militaries in the world, from going any further. I believe that peace is not going to be achieved with a military outcome. It's a diplomatic one, but it's only with the support of the entire community. And none of us want World War III, let alone on the territory of Ukraine. We had World War II on the territory of Ukraine, remember. They're about to have May 9th celebrations, V-Day in Moscow, but the place where V-Day should be celebrated is Kiev. The situation, I think, is one of convincing the Kremlin that this is not worth it. This is not worth it. They are better off with a healthy, vibrant, free Ukraine than they are with an ongoing war, bringing trucks back with their soldiers. And I think that's why the sanctions are important. I think that's why the transatlantic partnership, being strong and united, is important. I think it's important that we continue to say this is unacceptable and raise the price so that he has the so-called off-ramp, so that this ends peacefully.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Other questions?
Andrew Nagorski, I was with Newsweek in that area of the world for quite a while. I take your point about, Russia would be much better off with a prosperous, stable Ukraine. Obviously, Mr. Putin doesn't think so. And can't you assume that whatever his territorial ambitions, the last thing he wants is for your reforms to succeed? That he sees a successful Ukraine as a threat to him in the sense that of the example it might set for Russia. So how do, whatever Russians want to do territorially, how is their ability to disrupt the economy to make sure that things don't go well in your country?
I couldn't agree with you more. Our ultimate success will be the success of the economy. And that's why right now, this stabilization and returning to growth, eliminating corruption, and attracting additional investment into the country is absolutely paramount. Implementing that deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, ensuring that it's not just a piece of paper, that we're walking the walk, not talking the talk. That we are the new Ukraine. That we're not entering into an IMF agreement, taking the first tranche, and then what? That we break those habits, we break those traditions, that we break that mentality that exists both outside the country and inside, and we establish a new one. I just recently named 4 new deputy ministers, actually days before I came to the United States. And I know that doesn't sound like much, but I think it may be the first government in the history of 23 years where the ministers got to choose their own deputy ministers. I didn't ask anyone's permission. I didn't clear them with somebody. They're not somebody's political tools. They're my 4 deputy, and I kept one of my deputy ministers that was already there, and 4 young people who only 3 of them have never served in government before. They come from outside. They come from the private sector. All of them are younger than I am. The whole government, by the way, I'm the second oldest person in government, so the whole government is younger than I am. Someone graphed the ministries and the age of the ministers, and it was all the 30, 35-year-olds were here, and I was all the way over here on the graph. This is thinking, and I think if we can succeed in rebuilding the economy, I think we've succeeded. Next year, we see positive GDP growth, even if it's 1%. We'll have shown that this model can work in a former Soviet country.
Great. Well, we got a lot of questions here.
My name is Martin Burkhardt. I'm the U.S. correspondent for Danish newspaper Information. I wanted to ask you about the oligarchs. Your president is an oligarch, by origin at least, and he, like the former Italian premier, still has his own company's chocolate empire. He is involved in media, like Berlusconi was. So, and I think your constitution actually forbids that. And so I wanted you to talk about what can be done with the president in that position to basically deal with the monopolies that oligarchs have been using to control large sectors of the economy. And that speaks obviously to the question of transparency. It speaks to the question of competitiveness of the Ukrainian economy.
Yeah, I especially if you want to talk about oligarchs and having monopolies, is not something you can use with our president. Our president is involved in 2 sectors, confectionery and media in the past, both of which are very competitive. In fact, in confectionery, as an example, he competes with Nestle and Kraft. So is he a business tycoon? Yes, he was a business tycoon, there's no question. He is selling his property, so he has hired an investment banker, and the confectionery is up for sale, and I believe he has every desire to sell it. Unfortunately, we're having some trouble getting foreign investors into the country at a pace that we'd like to see, but I think he's committed. He's absolutely committed to divesting. As I said, he's turned it over to investment bankers, and the process is underway. I think there is a segment of the population in business tycoons which are more what you're describing, who are involved in monopolies. And I think antitrust is something that is critical for us to get past this. A true antitrust program, where we have to strengthen our anti-monopoly committee, we have to change the rules. I think everyone's aware of that. Some of the things that we've already done to try and change the behavior, let's say, of these business tycoons, some of whom are oligarchs, has to do with, as I said, bringing them back into the tax sharing burden, so eliminating transfer pricing, especially for commodities. That's important because commodities were being sold for 10 cents to mother companies outside, and then the mother companies outside were selling that commodity for $100 a ton, and we were not participating in the tax base of that profitable enterprise. I think it's important to have everyone pay their taxes from an administration standpoint as well. We adopted a law in December which allows us, if a company has acknowledged that they owe us taxes, that we can actually take the money from their bank accounts. In the past, oligarchs have avoided that by hanging it up in some court or just not being willing to pay. We eliminate that leverage that they have. Another area where oligarchs have been painful for us is in the banking sector. Particularly painful for me because I see us having to recapitalize banks, having to recapitalize our version of the FDIC. And we recently passed a law against related party lending or related party transactions that cause banks to fail. In particular, it's a law enforcement issue. If you've used related party transactions in a fraudulent and or criminal fashion and defrauded the depositors, you ought to be brought to justice. And that law is now in place. None of these things have been easy. Just this week, while I've been gone, we took control over a state-owned enterprise that we share ownership with one large businessman, tycoon, And that was very hard to get through the parliament to restore for an oil company, Ukrnafta, 51% state control rather than having to have 2/3. So step by step, you see very specific things happening. It's not easy. I'm originally from Chicago. Corruption is something you battle forever. But in Chicago, one of the big things that happened was law enforcement. I think that's where you see things changing in Ukraine with the new Anti-Corruption Bureau, with the newly named General Prosecutor. And I think that that's where you'll see the reality of the changes.
Thank you.
Let's get a question from this side. Yes, sir.
Madam Minister, I'm Ethan Browner from Bloomberg. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about your debt restructuring talks with bondholders, how it's going, how long you think the first round will last, how you're hoping that to persuade the Russians to do what they said they wouldn't do, which is to accept some kind of restructuring, that kind of thing. Thank you.
That's 3 questions. Okay.
Yeah.
The first question is
Answer whichever one you want.
we don't have a first and a second and a third round. We're on a very tight schedule to save the country. We need to complete the debt restructuring as a prior action for the May review of the IMF, meaning the June tranche. So I have between now and then. Working backwards, you understand we need to get through these negotiations relatively quickly. We are boxed in to parameters of a transaction, which we've agreed to, and I actually think they're relatively healthy perimeters, with regard to reducing the debt to GDP ratio over time, reducing the percentage of financing in any given year to pay debt, and reducing the overall balance of payments pressure during the time of the program over the next 4 years. Those 3 elements put us in a box that we need to then stay in. We will be using all the elements possible, meaning coupon reduction, principal reduction, maturity extension, in a collaborative fashion, finding some combination with our creditors. I believe we're doing it, as I said, on a collaborative basis. We're trying to do this in a very principled fashion. I've done very public presentations. I've invited all creditors willing to talk to us to register to talk to us, because these are tradable bonds. I don't know who holds them in many, many cases, including in the one that you mentioned. I don't know who specifically holds the $3 billion bonds issued via VTB Capital in December of 2013. So I invite them, and we will do this on the principles of transparency, inter-creditor equity, and we will do this on the basis of being fair. And I look forward to everyone participating, because I think it's in our mutual interest to get Ukraine back to a debt-sustainable country, a country that is in a good capacity to repay its debts. We're not there today, and only working together can we get there.
Great. Other questions? Sir.
Tim Fry from the Harriman Institute. You've talked a lot about the 93% of Ukraine that you control, and you've done a really marvelous job. Can you speculate a little bit about going forward, what that other 7% might look like as an economy going forward, and how could it be integrated into Ukraine?
Well, let me start with, it's never been disintegrated, disintegrated or detached.
Right.
It doesn't exist on a detached basis. There's a single banking system, there's a single gas system, there's a single electricity system, and that's why they've had so much difficulty through this winter, because it is part of a unified country. The Minsk II agreement gives a sense of the willingness of Ukraine to continue to decentralize authority, providing more authority to the local regions. We just, again, this week, today's Friday, this week, adopted legislation in accordance with that Minsk agreement, decentralizing power. I think there's, again, on the part of Kiev, on the part of our government, every vision and willingness to do so. We've actually decentralized our entire budget system in December, giving local authorities more tax authority, tax responsibility at their own level for the first time in the history of the country. So we're doing that again, whether or not it's part of a ceasefire agreement. That's what we're doing, because we know that's the right thing and that's what we want to do. So I can't say to you that I see it as a separate economy. It's part of Ukraine. What I see is regaining a semblance of peace, control, implementing in full the Minsk agreements, meaning pulling all heavy artillery out, foreign troops out, getting Ukraine recontrol its borders, and an exchange of all hostages. And I have to say that because there are hostages still being held. We have one of our Air Force pilots being held in Moscow. She's on her, I don't know, she stopped recently, but she had been over 75 days in a hunger strike. And that's part of the Minsk agreement. We need to get all of it done to restore peace. But Donbass is an important and integral part of the Ukrainian economy. That's why last year was so difficult for us. It will require, frankly speaking, tens of billions of dollars for rebuilding. I think there's a thing called the Kremlin's Black Book out there. If you take a look at it, it talks about the number of apartment buildings that have been bombed, the number of gas pipelines that have been destroyed, the number of the airport. Everyone's seen the Donetsk airport. This is tens of billions of dollars of rebuilding. It's a new Marshall Plan when the time comes.
Other questions? Okay, last, yes, sir.
Michael Levy, Council on Foreign Relations. I take your point on sanctions being important from a political standpoint to put pressure on Russia. But as you see a weakening Russian economy, does that create spillover challenges for Ukraine? How do you figure that dimension into your planning for the future?
If you mean from a trade perspective, our trade has already taken a big hit. There are multiple categories of trade that have been important in the past for Ukraine. Number one has been gas. We will never return to importing 100% of our gas. That's just not appropriate. No one would if they had a choice to diversify. They will always diversify, so that will not come back. There's a portion of our trade that's been very critical over the years, and that's military and dual-use technology, which has stopped, as you can well imagine. Why? I don't expect that to restart in the near future. There's a heavy industry portion of our trade, which is unfortunately based in Donbass and is in very rough shape. In many cases, the factories have been bombed, and so I don't know when that'll be rebuilt. And then the final part that's been very critical for us is food processing and food, where unfortunately Russia has implemented a number of non-tariff barriers to our trade. We would love for that trade to come back over time. There's nothing really we can do about those non-tariff barriers. To the extent, frankly speaking, that the Russian economy suffers, it's not good for anyone. But I don't believe, for example, that sanctions were meant to hurt the Russian people. They should not be meant to hurt the Russian people, the Russian economy. And I go back, the sanctions against Russia were meant to have a psychological effect on the decision-making with regard to aggression. And I think, the aggression stops. We implement the Minsk agreement. Happy to trade.
Great. Maybe one last question.
Stan Hagenbothman's Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship Program. I wondered if we could ask for a more personal reflection on you as a Ukrainian American. I was in Lviv in 1990, and there was such enthusiasm and hope. And I wondered if you could reflect on your own sense of what you're most proud of what's happened in Western Ukraine, and what you're most frustrated about and would like to see change in that area.
In Western Ukraine. I think Western Ukraine has done a fabulous job in developing new economic potential. Lviv has been the center for tourism. It's been a center for the IT cluster, and it's shown that it's diversified to a great extent from the traditional economy, and I think that's the big plus of Western Ukraine. Not to mention its patriotism, which is always very supportive and helpful. My greatest frustration in Western Ukraine, I never think of it that way, that's a great question. My greatest frustration would be that a large number of people have emigrated over the past 23 years. We've lost a great amount of the value of the people in Western Ukraine because they've been close to the border and they have a very international perspective, and they've been more willing to emigrate, whether it's to the United States, to Europe, or elsewhere. And so I would hope, both from a demographic standpoint, but just from a patriotism standpoint, that they will come back with the resources that they've accumulated, with the talents and skills that they've taken from abroad, and they come back home and repopulate the villages and towns and businesses and rebuild that part of Ukraine. It's a challenge, as you can well imagine, because you want every family wants to raise their children as best possible. I mean, what is your life? Your life is always about the next generation, and people make decisions for that generation. And when we as a government and we as a state can make sure that every parent that's making that decision is saying, yes, I want my child to grow up here. We have the proper education system, we have the proper medical system, I want my children here, then we'll have succeeded.
Well, Madam Minister, I can't resist saying it. When you're finished in the Ukraine, I think there are other countries who could use your insight and leadership. But look, on behalf of all members of the
vacation
council
after
who are here today and listening, thank you ever so much.